It's 1994. Mandela becomes the first black South African president, Jeff Bezos founds Amazon, the UK-France Channel Tunnel opens, and one of the most profound music algorithms of the 20th century is released to the public. CPU Bach. CPU Bach is arguably one of the strangest video games of all history. First of all, it came out on the 3DO game console, a console that was expensive, that had a lack of exclusive games, and was up against tough competition with the likes of the Super Nintendo and then the Sony PlayStation. In the end, the 3DO console was a complete failure. But the game, CPU Bach itself, was developed by one of the world's most influential video game developers, Sid Meier, the man who created the Civilization series and helped establish the strategy game genre. But CPU Bach wasn't a regular game. In fact, there's very little gameplay in it at all, because all the game did was compose music in the style of Bach. There wasn't very much for the user to do. They could change the probability that a certain genre or style of music should be generated. So if we have more of these notes in vivace, for example, that increases the chance that a vivace piece is generated. Also for instrumentation, so if we have more notes in the flutes, then that also increases the chance that we have a piece with flutes in it. You could also change what sort of images should accompany the composition. So photos of beautiful scenery, a trippy kaleidoscope, an accompanying musical analysis, or Bach himself performing the music. But other than changing these very generic settings, the user can't do anything. It is a terrible game. And just like the 3DO it was launched on, it was a horrible failure. Or was it? Economically speaking, or from a gameplay perspective, yes, it's a failure, but musically speaking, it is incredible. Now, I know that the MIDI sounds are pretty bad, but don't let that fool you. These compositions are actually very sophisticated, and if you notate them properly and give them a better instrument sound, they are surprisingly good. Sid Meier was a big Bach fan, but he didn't develop the software completely alone. He was greatly helped by the doctorate of music theory and composition, Jeff Briggs, who, by the way, was the composer of the original Civilization soundtrack. Despite the commercial failure of CPU Bach, apparently both Sid Meier and Jeff Briggs were convinced that their program was special, because 2 years after the game was released, they managed to get a patent for the program titled System for Real-Time Music Composition and Synthesis, and goodness gracious, is this a dry read. A big part of the success of CPU Bach is its use of something called rules and tendencies. A rule is something that you can't break. In a melody, for example, long notes weren't allowed to be dissonances. In this style of music, you don't really want your melody to land and stay on a dissonance for a long time. Also, a leap of more than a fifth in one direction had to be followed by a step back in the other direction. And again, this is a typical rule for melodic building, not only in Bach, but in almost all genres of classical repertoire. But then there were the tendencies. A tendency is almost like giving the program a desire to do something. For example, in a melody, the program would prefer to use small steps instead of leaps. It would prefer to continue any scale passages, and it would also prefer to pattern match previous patterns in the melody. It also disliked repeating notes. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of CPU Bach was that it rated its own output. It would generate a whole lot of different musical material and then give each of the examples it had just created a score. The musical material that received the most points was then used for the final composition. The patent also states, solutions generated by the system with apparently negative qualities may be used if there are enough important positive qualities. This is a fascinating idea. There is a bit of a danger in algorithmic music generation to focus primarily on musical correctness. No parallel fifths, no parallel octaves, you can't modulate like that, don't use a second inversion there, blah blah blah. Although these things are of course important, CPU Bach took other elements into consideration as well. It was discouraged from creating melodies that were too narrow or too broad. It didn't like it if a melody had too many leaps, but also if a melody didn't have enough leaps. Essentially, it was treating musical expression as being as important as the rules of music theory, and as quoted before, if there were enough positive elements to a musical figure, the program would sometimes just ignore the negative qualities. At a cursory glance, it really does sound like Bach, and it is tremendously expressive. The motives, the melodies, the development of material, it's very well done. The way the program modulates effortlessly from one key to another is also very impressive. But if you take a closer look, you do find some weird stuff popping up pretty often. Parallel fifth, parallel octave, and what the heck is this? This is the weirdest cadence I've ever seen. These are technically all mistakes, but the thing is, who cares? It doesn't really matter because it's so expressive. It's an expressive algorithm. I don't know about you, but this program has a sort of magical, mythical effect on me. Maybe because this incredible ancient program is locked away behind an extinct video game console, but also because it can compose practically infinite original compositions in the style of Bach. And once it's composed something, if you don't immediately save that composition, it's gone, it disappears. No one will ever hear that piece of music ever again. In 2024, CPU Bach will be 30 years old, and my sincere hope and perhaps even plea to Sid Meier would be to release the musical brains of this program onto the internet for everyone to try out. This is an incredible program that has been misunderstood for 3 decades, and yet from a music theoretical perspective, it is nothing less than a work of genius. It's about time it receives the attention it truly deserves.